The studies show 70% of transformation projects fall flat on their face because of the communication. When the idea was born, there was a lot of focus on making sure that all the questions and the answers were lined out. But then when it came time to bring it to the larger public, they didn't think of the next set of questions. If in the communication process you're not addressing that, you fall. Hi, I'm Karen Gilhooly, host of Make Minutes Matter podcast. And today, I've got the wonderful pleasure of meeting with someone very dear to me, my business partner, Dr. Brian Glibkowski, the founder of a new communication framework called Answer Intelligence, or AQ for short. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about the AQ framework, but we're also going to be talking about Brian's experiences in coming to find these different theories and how appropriate they are in the workplace. So for our audience that's been breathlessly waiting to hear about the framework, maybe you could explain it very quickly.
There's a circular structure, so I'm sure this will be made available. And surrounding the circle are questions. So we'll start in the middle with the what question. And you go horizontally across the circle, and you have a concept and metaphor. So an example here would be, if you ask me, Brian, what is leadership? I could say, leadership is inspiring others and holding them accountable. Concept answer. Then I could say leadership is like two ropes. When the ropes are separate, they're strong. When they're braided together, they're stronger. That's how I lead each meeting. I'm going to inspire and hold people accountable. So two different answers to the same question. So that's the what. Then we can move up to why. And the why question is answered with theory and story. Theory is cause and effect logic. So for example, I could say leadership leads to reduced turnover. And there's empirical evidence for it. Your examples in your work life may be consistent with it. That's theory, cause and effect. Then you have story. We all know what story is. But even though people know what story is, they get it wrong all the time. So, we ask someone for a story, they may provide an example. An example is different than a story. An example is missing many of the attributes of a story, like drama, right? Beginning, middle, and end, characters, etc. So we have companies masquerading around saying, here's a case study. When it's an example, it's not a story.
Right.
So we know what those answers are, particularly the story, the theory, cause, and effect. You could also call that strategy if you're more comfortable with that vernacular. Then we move down to the bottom of the circle. There's the how question, and going across the row, you have procedures and actions. So procedures and actions are related but distinct. So procedures are the steps. So here's the 3 steps I'm going to lead the meeting. Actions, you can think of each step being a bucket, are concrete things we do in each of the steps to bring it to fruition. So if I say beginning, middle, and end of a meeting, very simple procedure. In the beginning of the meeting, what can I do? I could have a best practice action, and that would be a agenda slide. And then anywhere throughout the presentation, I could use, for example, a unique action. Which is something that's absolutely unique, no one else does it, or relatively unique, very few people do it. So for example, if you press Control-B on the Microsoft keyboard or PC in PowerPoint mode, try it if you're at home, and it won't break your computer. The screen goes to blank, black. And that's a very powerful, unique action. I might use that if we're going off topic, or Karen, you're in the audience, you're talking. I'm going to go to black, so I'm going to give you the floor. I'm being respectful, right? So anyways, that's an example of the 6 answer types.
So just to put this into everyday language, so the best practice would be, let's agree on what we're talking about, okay? And I'm going to give you the definition of it, the concept, flavor it up with a metaphor just to give it a little color, maybe situate it better in your mind. Then I might swing up to why. So if we agree on this, now I'm going to tell you why I think it's important. And I might even share a little story about that just to reinforce it. Then after we're all done with that, anticipating that the conversation's still alive, then we move down to what we're going to do about it. And so, and the conversation could also go in the other direction. It could start with what. You might talk about what you're doing. So the steps and the action, the procedures and the actions.
The how, yeah.
And yes, and then you might go up to the top where you're talking about why all of this is important. So, yeah. So in the workplace, you've done a lot of work from a consulting perspective, talking to different organizations, as have I, and it's just fascinating when you see the amount of waste that's related to poor communication. I mean, this gap, I'm going to hit the microphone here, but the gap between what I'm saying and what others are hearing, this is where all the escalations are, the red tape, the frustration, the burnout. This is where the action's at. There's no action here, just frustration. So what are your thoughts about using this in the workplace?
First thing comes to mind, it's like I must be inspired by religion today for some reason.
Okay.
Singing from the same hymnal.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
We sound better when we sing from the same hymnal. Mm-hmm. That's both in terms of content, but also structure of the notes, the musicology of it. And in AQ terms, what we're talking about, we're going to communicate more effectively when we have a similar structure we're going to use. If there's a what question, we're going to answer the concept and metaphor. We're going to understand how to navigate that. And it gives us a framework to then pour in our content. And I think what you often have happen in the workforce is because people are not aware of this framework. Like if you did a little poll right now to people in your office, do a question, what's going wrong with X, or whatever the question you want to ask, you're going to get answers that are probably not all consistent with the AQ framework.
Right.
And that's a problem. So what this allows us to do, for example, just to illustrate this, let's say we're having that conversation about employee engagement, to revisit that. And I give my definition that I've already given, and I talk about cognitive, physical, emotional engagement, and I look at you, Karen, and you're not quite getting it. And what you could do is say, Brian, can you give me a metaphor to explain that? If we're on the same page with AQ.
Right.
Or even if we're not on the same page, I could say, Karen, would you like me to give you a metaphor? And I could say, engagement's like a magnet in iron filing. It's a force, right? Then we're getting at what it is. And there's reasons you have two different answer types to each of the questions, because one of the answer types appeals to sort of the logical side of the brain, the other sort of the emotional side of the brain. Concepts, they can be defined and dimensionalized. Arguably, they're the most logical answer type there is. The other side of the equation, metaphors, arguably the most subjective, right? It's very intuitive. Aristotle says that great metaphors are a sign of genius. This sort of spark coming out of nowhere. No one says great definitions are a sign of genius.
Well, they might. They might if you got 100 on your vocabulary test.
Yeah, but to bring this back to your question, the point is, I think the biggest issue is we are not being intentional with our communication. That means not using AQ skills, which were just sort of, around the periphery of what those skills are. You understand the skills, but then you have to be a student of the content.
Yeah.
So we can't be sitting in the meeting talking about engagement. If no one's writing articles about engagement, we haven't watched any videos, we haven't watched your podcast about engagement. I'm sorry.
Knows. Yeah.
That's just not going to cut it.
Yeah.
It's not going to work.
So when I think about, again, this concept of communication in the workplace and how it slows things down, I mean, we look at the world today, and there is so much going on right now. I can't think of one company, whether it's an incredibly big one or a little itty-bitty tiny one, that isn't transforming in some way. So new technology, new customer expectations, new products, you name it. There's all kinds of things swirling around. And if the conversation is not appropriate within the firm, how do you actually get those change, that change program, the change agenda, the transformation agenda? How do you get that over the finish line? I think that really slows things down, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think AQ can be applied to any topic. It sounds grand, but I think it's true. But change is definitely one of the most important ones. You think about change. Change initiatives fail all the time. And they fail because basic questions are not connected to the proper answers. So people are asking themselves, what exactly are we doing? Why are we doing it? How are we doing it? And another thing related to this, again, going back to that teacher quote where the teachers ask the questions, the students don't. What people don't realize is that when we learn, we ask the questions. So the really profound point here is that when change initiatives occur, they start at the top, and you get this group. What do? They go through all the question asking, mapping it to answers. They understand it, they get it, but they don't have the ability to take that knowledge that's been acquired and transfer it to questions and answers for other people to get.
Yes.
So what happens is people are engaging in this change process, and there's no way really to communicate and discuss these basic questions that were wrestled with before.
Right.
So what happens? The people doing the change don't have the answers, and they're not engaged, they're not motivated, they lose steam for the change.
Right.
And you can think of anyone that's been through change and think of why it's failed, and it probably connects to some of these questions. At some point, people were saying, why are we doing this?
Yeah.
What exactly doing?
Yeah.
How we do this? You know?
That's true. So, the studies show 70% of transformation projects fall flat on their face because of the communication. And what you're talking about is absolutely true. So up at the top, somewhere when the idea was born, there was a lot of focus on making sure that all the questions and the answers were lined out. But then when it came time to bring it to the larger public, they didn't think of the next set of questions. So for example, like, well, what does this mean to me? Do I still have a job? What new skills do I need? If in the communication process you're not addressing that, you fall. Yeah. And I think that's one of the beautiful parts of the framework is that it teaches you to anticipate the questions that other people are asking, whether it's in their brain or whether it's actually coming out of their mouth.
2 points really. You're making a really great point going back to the the school context. So as the age of the students increase, the teachers are asking more questions. They're not taking consideration the questions of the students.
Yeah.
Same thing with change. When you've answered the questions, you tend not to ask those same questions again. They seem obvious. And then as we cascade these change initiatives down to the employees, they're not allowed to ask the questions properly. They're not being connected to answers. Everything just seems stunted.
Yeah.
And it's not going to be effective.
No, it's not. Because at the end of the day, what these people, it's very personal. A conversation is personal.
Yeah.
It's a personal thing. Somebody's brain needs more information, and it's reaching out, and when it doesn't get the information that it needs, it doesn't react very well. It shuts down, turns off, burns out, name any one of the negative implications of it, but they certainly aren't inspired. Right. And in change initiatives, if there was one superpower that you need, in addition to the communication proposition, it's having that determination and the grit to keep going, to recognize that nothing's going to be perfect while you're chugging it out of the station. You're going to run into problems, obstacles, things you hadn't anticipated. But if you can talk about it, then you can get things back on track. But if you don't have that foundation, it just goes sideways, and like I said, it just collapses on top of each other. One of the other pieces that I found in our research was the whole amount of time that's wasted. So for our public that's listening, you should know that on an average daily basis, each employee wastes somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 hours every day because of poor communication. So if you want to think about that, 2 hours every day on an average work week of 5 days, that's 10 hours. That's more than an entire workday, right into the bin because of this. Now, I don't know of any organization on the planet right now that has that type of time, money, and energy to throw away. I just don't know. So it just seems to me that if people were really serious about trying to figure out how to make their organization more efficient, more engaged, optimize, you name it, that this would be a place to really spend some time and think about it.
Yeah, I totally agree. Going back to ground we've covered, high EQ is the ability to map questions to answers and understand these skills, which hopefully we can get to next, maybe an example or two of the skills. And then second, the content.
Yeah.
And to punctuate this, one of the top golf instructors in the world we interviewed in the Golf Digest top 50 list was someone that taught half the people in the top 50 list. So this is the guru's guru.
Wow.
And after the interview was over, just sort of, some of our research interviews, I just asked him candidly, do you always get the metaphors right? He said, yes. But if I don't, I have another one at the ready. And he also said, before I asked this question, he said that within the first 2 minutes of teaching someone, he can fundamentally change their game of golf. So this is what we're talking about, the difference between average communicator and communicator at the highest level.
That's right.
You have the right metaphor, it's compact, it's tight, the right story. It's no different than someone crafting a great speech, whether it's Martin Luther King's speech or any kind of topic. Imagine if you had that same facility and focus for everyday communication around the hallways, et cetera, and so forth. That's what these golf instructors had. They weren't giving speeches. They were delivering answers to important questions and delighting everyone.
And that's their job. And they did it well.
They did it well.
So in order to practice this, you do need some skills. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about the skills and how they're applied. Maybe give us an example of one or two.
Certainly. I'll give you a metaphor to set it up.
Please.
So we
please
think
do.
of different skills. You can, for example, here we're the crypto center is like right across the street here, and basketball is played there. So you think of basketball, and there's different ways to score in basketball. You can do a free throw, three-pointer, jump shot, layup, etc. These are different ways to score. These skills are different ways to influence. These are different ways to provide answers. So, I'll just give you 2 examples.
Okay.
One is answer twice. And so we've already
It's one of my favorites, by the way.
We started to cover this ground a little bit, but it's the idea of in one utterance, if I'm working with a direct report for the first time, they're going to have questions, implicit, explicit, or latent. They're wondering, they may be explicit. Brian, what's leadership like for you? What do you think leadership is? It could be implicit. They're squiggling a little bit. They want to know, trying to size me up. Or it could be latent, where they should be asking the question, but they're not.
Yeah.
So I can provide, answers to that question. When I provide 2 answers in at one time, it's answering twice. So just to cover ground we've already covered, I think leadership is inspiring others and holding them accountable. It's like the two ropes. I go through that, deliver it effectively, and by answering twice, you appeal to the left and right side of the brain. And so this is a great technique when it's an important question that needs to be answered, when people don't have, there's differences of understanding. It's a great point of emphasis.
And when you're in a crowd.
When you're in a crowd,
So you might be addressing a whole bunch of people, all of who are right and left brain thinkers.
Yeah.
And you absolutely have to make sure that point is landed. Then that's an excellent technique to do that.
Absolutely. And like all the different skills, you want to use them in moderation. If you're Michael Jordan, I'm sorry to be in LA and say Michael Jordan, but if you're Michael Jordan from Chicago, you could dunk and do it over and over again and always score with your dunks. But you play against opposition, and if you always try to do a dunk, you get blocked or something like that. Well, it's not quite like that with communication, but if I'm always answering twice, it's going to get a little monotonous.
Yeah.
So, you got to use different techniques. But another technique you could use is answering with style. So this examines individual differences, and for those looking at the wheel, there's different colors, red, yellow, and blue. So you have the red colors, which are story and metaphor. They're relational answers. They connect to experiences and emotions, and I know you love those, Karen. And then second, you have the analytical answers, concept and theory. They explain and predict in a complex world. That was my default. I love those. And then you have
That's why we get along together so well.
That's right. Then you have the practical answers. It's getting work done. And the idea of answering style is know your own style, deliver on what you're good at, but more importantly, know the style of others. So I had one student I coached at NAQ that was interviewing at a job at a top accounting firm, and she got the job. They said she was one of the best communicators they've ever seen, particularly coming out of undergraduate, amazing. And she was using these techniques. Yeah. So she'd go on LinkedIn, and she would analyze someone's profile and say, I'm interviewing with Karen. I think she's relational. And she would over-index on stories and metaphors. And but she would also test this in the beginning of the call. And it's not hard to find out. If you tell a story and then you're leaning in, metaphor, you're leaning in, tell me more, you respond with the story, you kind of know you're relational.
Yeah.
So regardless of the questions being asked, she over-indexed on stories and metaphors to ingratiate herself with the audience. and to give people a little bit feel for stories and metaphors. Just to give you two examples that will sort of contrast these. So, for example, we know the story of Romeo and Juliet. The metaphor is star-crossed lovers. So you have command, you move, boom, boom.
Right.
You move between the different answer types. So that's also a great technique, to use with others, know their style. And just one last thing to punctuate this, for those leaders out there, maybe you're working with a junior person, and oftentimes, not always, but they're concerned with how to do things.
Yes.
That may not be the appropriate time to give your war stories about why you should do things. They want to know procedures and actions to fill out this report. So you might want to over-index on the practical answers if that's the style that they're tending to gravitate towards.
Yeah. So I have a little homework assignment for our audience today, and just to put this to the test. So we've spoke today about the fact that in the framework, we're primarily looking at, in the business world, what, why, and how. And there are appropriate answers that go along with that. And I would challenge anyone that's listening to this podcast, the next time you're in a conversation where you are listening, not necessarily where you are an active participant, but listen and see how often people actually respond with the appropriate response. I've tried this now. I don't think I use a little chicken scratching, nothing too fancy. I don't think I've ever gotten through an hour conversation where I've seen someone answer the question correctly more than 5 times in an hour conversation. So we've got a lot of work to do out there, my friends, and think about what that looks like. Think about what a world looks like where people can actually engage in a great discussion, where they're on the same page with each other, where the ideas are flowing back and forth, and you can actually talk about getting things done so much more effortlessly. I just think that the world needs a better way to handle its interaction, because we sure aren't doing a very good job of it right now.
As usual, I usually end on a note say, I agree with you, Karen. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Brian, for being with us today. So for the viewing population, you want to just give a little shout out and how to get in touch with you?
Yeah, the best way to reach me is go to our website, raiseyouraq.com. You can contact me through the website there. So thank you again, Karen, for having me.
Welcome. Thank you. Have a great night.
Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of Make Minutes Matter. If you haven't done so already, please take a moment to subscribe to this podcast on YouTube or click the follow button on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And let me know what you thought of today's conversation by following us on Instagram at Karen Gilhooly 1. That's Karen, Karen, Gilhooly, Gilhooly, and the number 1. Let's make every moment in your career truly matter. Have a great day.